Hi everyone, it's Shane, and today I wanted to take a closer look at a zero trust model for OpenShift access. Now, one of the great things about OpenShift is that both admins and operators and developers use the same web console and APIs to manage the platform, as well as deploying and updating applications. So we enable that through providing authorization, authentication, and role-based access controls around those APIs and that web console. So there's no breaking out functions into separate networks here. All of those, or all of that required capability for both managing the platform and being able to deploy and develop applications is built into that same API and console. Now, what I find organizations typically want to do is provide some more control around those admins and operators, and particularly that privileged access. Now, ideally, we'd provide a multi-factor authentication for both admins and developers. That usually represents a pretty huge uplift for an organization's security posture, and usually I find typically they might start with just the admins. So what I'm going to look at today is how we can enable this model. We allow admins and developers access to the API in the console, and we're going to look at supporting multi-factor authentication for those administrators. So firstly, let's have a look at what that workflow looks like. So here I've got a developer user, and I'm going to log in to OpenShift as this user. Now, because this user doesn't have any elevated access, I haven't prompted for another authentication method. But you can see that this user doesn't have access to any projects, there's no pods, they can't list out anything, there's no permissions provided to this user. So let's log out of that user and we'll log in to a user account with some additional privileges. All right, so here I've got my admin1 account, and again, we're going to log in. Now, because this user has some additional privileges, we've been prompted for an OTP. And so I'm just going to provide that now. And now, since I've provided that additional level of authentication, my user is permitted access into the cluster, and you can see that they have that administrative access to be able to see all of the pods, for example, across all projects. So now that we've seen how that workflow comes together, let's look at how we've configured this with OpenShift. So to enable this workflow, we're using something called Red Hat Single Sign-On, which is provided with every OpenShift subscription. Now you can see here I've created an additional realm inside Red Hat Single Sign-On, and in here I've got my two users. I've got my user one, so that developer user, and this user isn't a member of any groups. So you can see group membership, there's no groups listed. Now I've also got my admin user created within Red Hat Single Sign-On. Now we can see that this user has an OTP created, and they're also a member of this super admins group. So what we're going to do is enable that, or map that super admins group to cluster admin access inside OpenShift. Now there's a few different configuration options we have to go through to enable that, or to map that super admins group across to the OpenShift cluster admin role. So the first thing that we need to do is to set up our Red Hat Single Sign-On platform as an identity provider. So to do that, I'll go to the cluster settings. I'll just zoom in a bit here so we can see a bit better. I'll go to configuration. And what I'm looking for here is the OAuth options. So if I have a look at the YAML spec there, you can see that I've provided an identity provider here called KeyCloak, which is the upstream project for Red Hat Single Sign-On. So I've mapped in here the CA so that we can validate those TLS connections back to the platform. You can see here we've provided the client ID OpenShift, and that's actually defined here in these clients for Red Hat single sign-on, I've got a client called OpenShift. And then we've got the issuer, which is our Red Hat single sign-on platform. So that's the configuration we need to make to the OAuth for OpenShift. Now the other setting I'm looking for here is for the web console, because we want to be able to customize that logout activity that we saw. So here I can see the web console. And if I have a look here, I've mapped the logout redirect to my Red Hat single sign-on platform. So when users log out, we're going to destroy that session in Red Hat single sign-on, and we're also going to redirect them back to the OpenShift console so they can sign in again. So that's the configuration we're going to make at the cluster level for OAuth and the web console. Now for user management, we've also made a couple of configuration changes. So here you can see I've created a role binding called SSO cluster admins. Now what this role binding does is it takes a group, in this case a group called super admins, and it maps that to our cluster role cluster admins. So anyone who's a member of this group, super admins, gets this cluster admin role and has access to all of those administrative capabilities. So we had that role created inside Red Hat single sign-on, and you can see it here, super admins, and you can see the members. We've got that admin1 user as a member of that group. But what we need to do is map that group into OpenShift. Now to do that, I'm using something called the group sync operator. And the group sync operator allows me to synchronize those groups from, in this case, Red Hat single sign-on into OpenShift. So anytime a change is made to that group, or we remove a group from Red Hat single sign-on, we're going to synchronize all those changes across into OpenShift. And you can find this operator in the OpenShift operator hub. So because I have the group sync operator running on OpenShift, you can see we also have this group created, super admins, and we have that user admin1 also mapped into that group, exactly as we have it defined in Red Hat single sign-on. So this allows us to manage users and administrative access through Red Hat single sign-on and to have those changes reflected in OpenShift. And this is how we can start to provide more control and provide those additional authentication factors around privileged access on the platform. So what we saw in that demonstration was a quick look at how we can move closer to a zero trust model for OpenShift access. Being able to provide that centralized control around privileged access, as well as those additional authentication factors for the administrative users. So I hope this has been useful, and you can find all of the documentation on this configuration in the OpenShift docs. Thanks.